Hello and welcome to yet another episode of Tai'Shar, Manethrin, a Wheel of Time podcast. I, as always, am Will.
I'm Sam.
We're excited to bring to you another show update. This one is going to be quick because we don't have a lot of new information since last month. This week's Wheel of Time Wednesday was not altogether that newsy in a lot of ways. Yeah, did you get to see it, Sam?
Yeah, checked it out and it's like, is that it? I mean, that's cool. I'm glad, but we're spoiled after last month.
For those of you who didn't see, Michael McLatin was confirmed as Tam Althor, which was not a huge surprise. For one thing, he was in the video last month, and people had already noticed him. For another thing, there weren't too many roles he could have been playing if we're looking at just the first couple of episodes in that video.
We talked about it when we saw him in the video, and thinking back, it's like, yeah, there were other characters in the Two Rivers that he might have played, but it's like, nah, the more I think about it, he pretty much has to be Tam. I mean, of the available characters, he's, other than maybe Abel Cawthon or something.
So it made sense, and I'm excited to see him in that role. Very different from his character on Game of Thrones, kind of playing against, like basically the opposite of the type that we're used to, which for folks who mainly know Rosamund Pike from like Gone Girl, I guess that's kind of the same thing there. She's playing Moraine, a very calm and composed, non-psychopathic killer type person.
Right. Michael McLaden is not playing this scheming, conniving man who backstabs his liege lord. Instead, is a nice father figure.
Right. Yeah. Assuming that they are maintaining consistency with the book, Tam,
which they better.
Right. Yes. Especially in the case of Tam. Tam is in one way, he kind of subverts some tropes because, and this is a tiny bit of a spoiler, but only for the very beginning of Eye of the World. And if you haven't read at least that much, then I'm shocked that you're like listening.
Hi, Mom.
Yeah, exactly. They subvert the trope of the father figure dying right off the beginning, and so Tam does play a role later on because of that, and he becomes.
The joke is that he has this major role in the first season, then we'll see him again around season 10, 9,
Yeah, exactly.
And disappears for a while, but he does come back.
We won't see a whole lot of him, the first season or two, or maybe 3, if they, depending upon how they split up the books and everything. But we'll be excited to see him utilized, and
we will be talking about him shortly in The Shadow Rising.
Absolutely, we will be. So if you want to hear us talk about the character of Tam for a little bit, make sure to join us for next week, which that segues nicely into a little bit of housekeeping business about our podcast. We got a lot of helpful feedback over several different surveys, which the survey is always open. It's still available. If you want to anonymously tell us how much we're bad at this, you can do that at tsmpodcast.com and look for the survey link there. One of our survey bits of feedback was that they wanted to have more of the podcast released more often. Another one was that it was a little bit too long. So taking both those into account, we're going to look at kind of separating out our podcast into shorter segments and release them more often. So we're going to try. We'll see what happens according to mainly my schedule, but we're going to try to have a weekly show, at least through the end of the year. We should be able to pull that off. So
heck yeah.
And shorter segments on that. So you'll be getting a little bit less, but each week you'll be getting some.
And the good thing about that, with us adopting that format for The Shadow Rising, is that is a book where a lot of things happen. I mean, just looking at the first half, I mean, say it's like 500 pages, and like there are so many things that happen. So it'll be easy for us to, spend 30 minutes and, diving into a few chapters and still actually cover some ground, because it's not like, say, the Slog later on where things don't happen as, rapidly. There's a lot of stuff that happens in this book.
Yeah, and for those who are wondering how we're going to cover the Slog, it'll be much more quickly than we cover the rest of these books, I suspect, by the time we get to that. But that's a ways away yet.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure it'll
Some
get here
good books
quicker than we.
between.
And as Sam and I both said, we're both fans of the books in the slog.
Definitely.
It just goes a little slower than the rest of the series. So I wanted to also give a couple of quick shout outs to a few of our listeners. We have recently launched a Instagram account, and if you haven't found us on Instagram yet, it's podcast TSM is our Instagram, and a Twitter account that's also podcast TSM. So you can follow us on there. And we are also on Facebook. So you can just look for us, Tai'Shar, and a Wheel of Time podcast, or also at podcast TSM. So look for all of those. Follow us on the Facebooks, the Twitters, the Instagrams, whatever the kids are into. So first off, on Instagram, if you're not following us on Instagram, we mainly put out some memes related to Wheel of Time. Occasionally we'll do clips from one of the episodes or updates on the show or whatever. On one of the memes we had user Mike R. Labs say, "Love your page and podcast." That was just such a nice little thing to say. I said, cool. Shucks, man, we'll just have to give you a shout out on the next episode. So Mike Labs, thank you for saying such nice things about us.
You have inspired me to get an Instagram.
Yes. Yeah, Sam's on Instagram now. So there you go. The other one, we got a message from Facebook user Hugh. He is from Australia. And I really thought hard about reading this message with an Australian accent, but then I figured, seeing as I'm definitely not going to sound legit to a real Australian, I decided not to embarrass myself. So he says, "Hi guys, huge fan from Australia here, loving the podcast and absolutely stoked about the upcoming TV show. Hoping for the best anyway. Just wanted to say that I read The Eye of the World for the first time as a 13-year-old way back in 1994 and was instantly hooked. I can still remember the agony of waiting for the next book to come out and also loving the opportunity to reread the series each time. I've read The Eye of the World at least a dozen times. Was absolutely stoked with Sanderson's work finishing the series, but I also was devastated that a very real chapter of my life was finished. Anyway, keep up the great work." So thank you, Hugh.
Wow, Hugh, you read each one of them as they came out and had to deal with that wait for every book. That is impressive, sir. I did that for, probably the last 6 or 7, and that was like bad enough, but I can't imagine from the very beginning.
Yeah.
That is impressive.
It's really because I read them after they all came out, and I've said this before, I am totally Johnny-come-lately. For our listeners who have been reading the book since they came out, I can't identify with that because I got to listen to them on audiobook back to back to back to back.
Right.
And that was awesome. I can't imagine what it would have been like.
I remember just absolutely not remembering, like, picking up the book and be like, I'm so stoked for this, and then reading the prologue and be like, oh, what is happening? And it this was really before there was a lot of wikis and there were summaries online, but I would maybe I would pick up the last one and read the last chapter or something, but it would still take me a good 4 or 5 chapters to really go, okay, I'm into this. I know what's happening, especially because, I was like eagerly awaiting Winter's Heart,
right,
in the midst of the slog, but it's still like, I didn't know it was the slog then, I was like really excited for it. And I loved reading it, but it was very much like that. Like, okay, why was I excited for this again? What is it? What's happening? Who is where, sort of thing. And just like to nowadays with Game of Thrones books and such, it's the same exact kind of feeling as the people waiting for George R. R. Martin to put out The Winds of Winter.
Sure. It's just funny to think about, for me, as like I said, as a person who immediately went from one book to another, having to read Crossroads of Twilight and then wait after that.
Yes.
I didn't think about that at the time, but looking back after having finished the series, I would have had a hard time not being like, what a jerk, Jordan. Come on, man.
Yeah, yeah. You know, especially because he says, like it said in his biography at the end of the blurb at the end of the book of like about him. He says he intends to continue writing until they nail his coffin shut.
And about did it too
Yep,
is what
sure enough.
to me this news tops the Wheel of Time Wednesday because it was personally exciting. But we're on Reddit. There's a TSM podcast Reddit account that occasionally will put memes up on Wetlander humor on the Wheel of Time show r/WOT show subreddit. Somebody posed the question, does anybody know how much money is in the Wheel of Time series? Because there's been a lot of talk about it being expensive.
Sure.
There's haven't been any numbers around. They've, of course, the Lord of the Rings series also being produced, I think is just in pre-production now,
Another
though.
series, another season of Carnival Row. I'm sure.
Right.
Not to mention the boys. I mean, there's a lot of. I mean, big dollar shows.
Yeah, a lot of money being thrown around. So I mentioned that Brandon Sanderson has commented on Amazon spending an appropriate amount of money on the show based on his visits to the set. Now, Brandon Sanderson is active on Reddit.
Oh yeah, Mistborn.
Yes, so I tagged him in it when I
Yeah,
read it.
yeah.
I said,
Slash you, Mistborn. Yeah.
and was delighted. He jumped in and replied. So
Nice.
he said, I don't know exact numbers, but it really does look good to me. I got a very high production quality vibe from the sets. The final product, however, will be the real measure. So we got a little bit of contact there from Brandon Sanderson himself.
Should ask him to be on the show.
Yes, I thought about it, but I didn't want to press my luck.
Oh yeah, no, I hear you. Just keep on posting.
My comment back, though, and he didn't reply to this, but was, wait, are you saying we should watch something before we make a decision about the quality of it? That's just crazy talk right there.
Love it.
And then I wrote under that, on the serious, thanks for the reply. I'll be talking about this on my podcast for a few years.
No doubt.
Yes. Remember that one time that Brandon Sanderson replied on Reddit? And it may be the only thing. I may have spent my one opportunity to get an answer from Brandon Sanderson.
Right.
Apparently, he's fairly active, though.
Right. Yeah, I've seen him post before for sure.
Yeah. It sounds like he doesn't really hold back on anything that if he can talk about it, he's going to talk about it in regards to the show.
Heck yeah.
That outside of like non-disclosure agreement stuff. So that was to me about the most exciting thing that happened in the relative to the show.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, man.
So beyond that, little bits have trickled out on the Daily Trolloc subreddit. There is a post with some photos of what appears to be a cottage that may have been destroyed by Trollocs. Can't be sure if this is something, as Narg explains. Narg likes to hear his name on our podcast, Narg tells me. So
very good.
Narg says, can't be sure this is for Wheel of Time, but it's in Prague, and Narg pretty sure it's from Carnival Row or Wheel of Time. Looking at the photo, and you can see this on the Daily Trolloc subreddit, it really looks like something that would go with the Wheel of Time. It's more of that era rather than the kind of Victorian,
industrial,
yeah,
right,
kind of stuff. So
cool.
It's a destroyed cottage, so you get a little taste maybe of the set there. It looks very high quality as far as the attention to detail and everything. Just a couple of photos, though. Nothing too newsy out of that. A little more interesting, there's a nighttime shot of what looks like a ferry crossing.
Cool.
Maybe,
hey, Terran Ferry.
Terran Ferry. The not a whole lot of info out of that one either, but you just get another little tiny tidbit. Beyond that, we haven't had a whole lot of new information. As they continue to shoot scenes, particularly the larger scenes, occasionally they'll be casting calls for groups of people. There was one that came out that said they're looking for teenagers, the age of 16 to 18, ideally ethnic types, Asians, African, Indians, both boys and girls. So I'm kind of wondering what scene that might be if we're thinking of like the first couple of books.
Well, you think about the fact that Emmons Fielders are going to be more ethnic,
Sure.
then it could just be, in Emmons Field,
Yeah.
villagers kind of.
Yeah, it could be. I suspect though that we're out of the first couple of episodes and probably
Oh, I see what you're
moved
saying.
on.
Okay, so yeah, so we're perhaps after they've left Emmons Field.
Yeah, and it might just be that they are looking for folks to fill in Camelin or
Barrelon.
um, yeah, Tarvalin, any of these kind of larger set pieces with lots of people could be going on there. A few weeks ago, they wrapped up a week of night shoots, according to some reports, and that, of course, is could be anything. The likely the fleeing from the two rivers
Sure.
is taking place mostly at night, so there's a lot of stuff that will happen at night in these books. So
Yeah, for
that
sure.
doesn't tell us a whole lot. But then they took a few days off because we got some Instagram posts from all of them kind of showing what they were doing with their time off. Rafe was in Paris. I actually posted kind of a question of what might they be shooting in Paris. Most people said, oh, they're not shooting anything in Paris. Rafe is just taking some time off, which it seems like that was the case.
Yeah.
But I did kind of wonder because of the photo he took had kind of a palace garden kind of look to it. If
If it
maybe,
was Camelin, perhaps.
yeah, maybe it was Camelin. I don't know that that's likely, but especially as one of our listeners pointed out that there were no sheep herders in the photo, so that had jumped over a wall.
Right, right.
The least effective palace wall in the history of palace walls.
Sure seems that
Um,
way.
so those are little bits that have trickled out, other than the big one about the Tam casting. At this point, is there anything in the first couple of episodes, Sam, that you're just really excited to see? Looking in these first two books, there's a couple of scenes that I can think of that I'm excited to see. The later books, I get more and more excited about, to
Oh
be
yeah,
honest.
totally. Yeah, there's in the book we're going to discuss this week. There's so many scenes. I'm like, oh, this is gonna be really cool. I hope they get to this. But
Yeah,
yeah, there's a lot of that. That's like, well, man, that's like thousands of pages in. Like, I hope they get there. Hope it goes well. But yeah, maybe in the first book, I just can't wait to see Rand talk to a Trolloc.
yeah,
And just that
right,
whole fight scene, see what Myrddraw look like. Of course, see Moraine do her thing with the one power while fighting Shadow Spawn.
right.
All those things in the first few chapters will be really fun.
And it'll also be a good measuring stick for the feel of the show. Is it
Yes, exactly.
going to be really high quality as far as all of those things go? How, are we going to be going for more of a dark tone, or is it going to be a little more measured? I think that's a lot of the questions out there, and I see a lot of kind of back and forth
Yeah, you
about.
could 100% see them going either direction. Really, I mean,
Right. And I mean, I'm not thinking it needs to be like super light family friendly exactly, but at the same time, there's a lot of ways in which the book, we've talked about this before, the
right?
books have opportunities to go more grimdark and they don't.
Yeah,
And so when people say, oh, it needs to have this kind of dark, gritty feel, I'm not 100% with that because I feel like that's not true to the tone of the books. There's moments for sure where things get
yeah,
dark,
right.
and of course places where you could have some real gory violence or splashes of some real darkness, but the overall tone of the book is fairly hopeful, and it doesn't get into the kind of detail or really the frankly the kind of the gross kind of stuff
Right,
that
right.
you have
Any
in
of
like
that
Game of
would
Thrones.
happen off screen. And of course, it's like I know people don't want us to get off topic too much, but on the subject of Game of Thrones, it again is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. We have to at least
Yeah.
address it. And the thing I think about is the fact that Benioff and Weiss tended to lean into the gratuitous violence, nudity, grim dark kind of stuff beyond what George R. R. Martin did. And so, and you look at how
Yeah.
successful Game of Thrones was, and you could see how Amazon might be interested in trying to do that. Now,
Right, exactly.
I hope they don't. I don't want them to do to the Wheel of Time what Benioff and Weiss honestly did to Game of Thrones, even though Game of Thrones certainly had plenty of that in the books as well.
Right.
It was definitely not to the level of detail that is in the show at all.
Yeah. Well, and it's a good point to say that there existed in the source material with Game of Thrones a level of sexuality and violence and everything that did lean in the direction of, certainly.
You could say it's in the DNA, maybe more so.
Yeah, but you don't really see that as much in The Wheel of Time. Like I said, I'm not trying to downplay the fact that you do have some dark moments,
right,
and you do have some kind of adult kind of themes and topics throughout the plot, but it's not the way that the overall tone of the books works, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with that, 100%.
I saw a post about this a little while ago. I think people were kind of making a bigger deal about it than maybe really was intended, but there were 2 added crew members to the IMDb page, and one of them especially is mainly known for being an intimacy coordinator. What is an intimacy coordinator, you ask?
That's a heck of a specialization.
Yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. And so some folks are wondering if this means that we're going to get some intimate moments in the show, and what does that mean and everything. Well, for one thing, if we're talking about season 1, there's really
not a lot in season 1. Or in the
first couple of books.
Right.
There's not really much opportunity for that if they're staying true to the books. And so I think we should all be hopeful that this doesn't mean that the 2 folks are Yaret Dor and Enric Ortuno. And Enric really mostly does fight coordination. And Yaret Dor on her Twitter account is listed as both an intimacy coordinator and a fight coordinator. They both work for the same company that handles any kind of movement-oriented choreography and everything.
Gotcha.
So now there's no doubt that Yaret Dor, according to her IMDb, definitely specializes in intimacy coordination. I see this as a good thing regardless, because if there is anything happening, the position of intimacy coordinator's job really is to make sure that everything's on the up and up on set. And to me, it indicates a certain amount of decorum and professionalism that I hope is representative of a healthy working environment for the cast and crew.
For sure.
Because that, to me, says that you're not as likely to end up with Me Too stories coming out of this later on.
Yeah, I mean, like we've talked about this to some degree throughout the books we've talked about so far. The fact that there is nudity, and oftentimes it's described in a way that seems unnecessary, like it just doesn't add anything to the scene. Having said that, it is in the source material, and it would be an explicit decision to not include it. So that you could definitely, sort of intimacy aside, the just random, moments of nudity are in the books. And so it's a real question about what direction they're going to go.
Sure.
Given the other genre shows that are out there, the other genre shows that Amazon has put out themselves have nudity. So it really is, an open question.
It's possible.
Yeah, for sure. Possible. It is. And then that, for better or worse, that's, there's a lot of TV out these days that sort of has that as part of their, strategy or whatever you want to call it.
Well, and I guess as the question often is, it'll come down to what audience they are really targeting.
For sure. Yeah, you don't see that certainly in Netflix kid shows.
Right. And I don't think it would be unwise to consider trying to include a little bit of a wider audience than you're getting with, say, a Carnival Row.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you look at for example, the Marvel movies don't have, nudity left and right either. So they're clearly catering to a wider audience. Star Wars movies. Right. So there's absolutely an argument to be made for saying, that's not an important piece of the story. Let's just skip it.
Really, I think, of course, you can always have those components without things getting out of hand. Just because you don't have things explicit doesn't mean that you're not still getting across the emotion.
I think it's a totally valid point. It just makes me think of The Empire Strikes Back, the original versus the special editions.
Right.
In Hoth,
Wampa.
the Wampa that takes Luke hostage, or not hostage is the wrong word. You know what I mean? Like captures him.
Hostage. Yeah.
I'm just imagining the Wampa with like a gun to his head, like give me all your money. Anyway, but in the original, you don't see it almost at all, and it's just better. Whereas there's a lot of things in the special editions where they make them more explicit using CG, etc., that just sort of takes away from the initial kind of power of the scene. And I think that, that's definitely the type of thing you're talking about.
As anybody who is a student of cinema will tell you, when it comes to horror, you not showing the monster is the best thing you can do for making something creepy. When you show the monster, it almost always ruins it. And so if you can avoid,
you think like
seeing
the Thing,
Jaws is the one that always comes to mind. And even more recently, you have Bird Box is a great example of a movie you never see the monster, and that's kind of the point.
Right.
And that makes it all the more terrifying. Now, some people may hate Bird Box.
I thought it was a good time. I mean, it had its problems, certainly, but it was almost unavoidable that sort of thing would have problems. I mean, it's...
the premise has its limitations, for sure.
Yeah.
But anyway, my point being that just because a show isn't explicitly showing something doesn't mean that it is somehow not adult, that it's not telling the truth about its source material or something. I disagree with people that tend to think like, oh, well, it's not for adults if it doesn't have X kind of content.
Oh, yeah, that's nonsense.
Let me tell you, most BBC shows don't have that content, and they're not for kids.
Oh man, that's true. I've been Rachel and I've just been kind of sitting there while she's watching Call the Midwife, and oh my goodness,
Yeah,
you want to talk about a show not for kids that's just depressing, but also sweet at times.
Having said all this, we're just going to have to see. It's like Brandon Sanderson says.
Sure.
I mean, I think it's interesting that every time he comments on the show, he always leaves that little caveat on, which is, hey, we're just going to have to wait and see how the show turns out before we make our judgments. Even a guy who's been to set and been involved in advising on the script and everything, he's just advising everybody to just wait and see.
And no matter what happens, there are going to be plenty of people on Twitter who don't care for most things, who are going to have problems with the result. And so those people, I say, no matter what this show is or isn't, it will not take away the books from you, ever. The books will always be there for you to come back and reread them as many times as you want and to think about them however you want. And you can love or hate the show.
New versions of things we love don't destroy the things we love. Sequels to things we love don't destroy the things we love. It's just new attempts at, yes, probably making money,
but for sure,
also you have to respect that there are people who are creative and putting their heart and soul into these things, and whether or not it ends up being any good, it doesn't mean that the people involved with it were evil intended.
Even if the show is terrible, if it brings more attention to the Wheel of Time, the books, which are something I love, I like that about it. I mean, this is, it's given us an excuse, not that we needed one, but to say, I'm going to go back and reread these and talk about it some more, and I think that there's something to be said for that, no matter how the show turns out, although I am optimistic.
That's our update. Like I said, we don't know a lot more, but just a few little bits and pieces here and there. Again, as always, if you enjoy the show, please rate us, give us a share on your social media, give us a like. Email us. We love to hear from you. Stuff at tsmpodcast.com, or Will at tsmpodcast.com, or Sam at tsmpodcast.com. All of those get to us. You can also tweet at us at podcast TSM. Talk to us on Instagram, whatever. If you have theories or things that you want to discuss, we'd like to discuss those too. So just let us know.
And then join us next week as we follow Rand and friends into the waste.
Yes, absolutely. This is a really great book.
I love it. I can't wait to talk about it.
Yeah, I think Daniel Green, who's one of the main YouTubers about Wheel of Time and everything, he, I think, may have ranked this one in like top tier as far as the books go. And I tend to agree.
Yeah,
it's
so much good stuff. So much, you get so much awesome backstory, so many cool flashbacks, and just so much stuff happens.
It's just a blast. So looking forward to going through that with you. Well, until next time, Sam.
Tai'Shar Manetheren.